Welcome back to the Evolving Warfighter. My name is Dr. Franklin Annis, and I am joined today by a special guest, Dr. Edward Risden. Dr. Risden is a professor of English at St. Norbert College in Wisconsin. He has published a number of books and essays on medieval and Renaissance studies, to include a book I highly recommend called Tolkien's Intellectual Landscapes. And thank you for being here today.
Oh, Dr. Ennis, thanks so much for including me in your program. I've seen some of the earlier installments, and I think you're just doing a wonderful project. So I feel honored to be included.
Thanks, sir. Well, today we're going to be talking about archetypal stories. Several months ago, I was contacted by a member of the Special Forces community concerning some negative behaviors they were seeing among new recruits. Special Forces recruits had this attitude that the Army needed them more than they needed Special Forces. And they asked if I had any opinions or advice on the matter. And after months of considerable thought on the matter, I concluded it might be due to the lack of some type of archetypal story or overarching stories that explains acceptable behaviors in our society and then provides a model for leadership that we currently lack, but maybe previous generations had access to. And we're currently at a place where, because we don't have these great archetypal stories, we fall into the trap of thinking about some very shallow stereotypes of behaviors that are really negative, instead of positive examples of how to behave. And I find it interesting how we lost track of the older archetypal stories, including the Arthurian legends. And even since we've lost that connection, we still seem to be trying to connect back to some type of overarching archetypal story. An example of that is the Army School of Advanced Military Studies. Their graduates are referred to as Jedi Masters. And it's interesting because George Lucas pulled very heavily from Japanese archetypal stories when he was writing Star Wars. And yes, it might be safer in our society to connect back for kind of religious reasons to those Japanese myths. And I know why you're not an expert in the military context. I was hoping that you can give us some insight about archetypal stories and how they're used inside a culture or society.
I'd be very glad to try to help you with that, yes.
So we'll get started, and I know that during our early exchange of emails, we talked about the differences between epics, myths, parables, and aphorisms. I was wondering if you could take a moment to define those terms and explain how they're different and how they might be used.
Yes, sure, thank you. To start with, epic. Epic had so much more influence in the past than it has now. An epic was most typically a long narrative poem. It typically dealt with heroic issues of some sort, and it almost always tried to answer some sort of question that the culture posed at the time and needed answered. So it's the epic is exactly what you're looking at. It's where you get to the archetypal stories. So they're substantial. They're long. They're sometimes difficult. They're elaborate, but they get right down to the meat of what a culture wants to know or needs to know about itself. Myth then. Myths are typically traditional stories that go back so far that no one knows the author of them. They also give you archetypal models. They're most typically stories of the gods. Once they get into heroes, some people consider those myths too. I think of them more as legends because they may come from actual persons and actual events. Not that they actually record them, but they may have that as their origin. Whereas myths I think of as most typically about the gods. But still, they tell us about our origins, about where the powers of the world and the universe come from, where our traits come from, why we behave the way we do in the world. Now, a parable, on the other hand, is a little friendlier story, usually just a brief narrative aiming at a particular point. They are also little packages of wisdom for a culture. A typical example would be something like the prodigal son. And of course, when the prodigal son returns, the elder sons, they're not too happy with dear old dad for welcoming the badly behaving son back with the party. And he says, it's not that I don't value you, it's just how much joy is there in the return of the lost one. And that's why we celebrate. Now that's still a hard one for most people to swallow, but it's an important message for that time and probably for all time. So that's a parable. And then an aphorism, another word for them is maxims. And they are really brief, crisp little sayings that contain nuggets of wisdom. So typical ones, one of my favorite poems, Beowulf, has a bunch of them. And a number of them come from the hero. And he will say something like, fate oft preserves the undoomed one if his courage holds. Now
Yeah.
that's also kind of loaded. It says you may get through if your courage holds. You may not, but then at least you may. And another one is better to avenge one's friend than to mourn overmuch. So he's actually counseling action in that case. So and Beowulf is just full of those. And traditional cultures tend to collect them and value them greatly. Sometimes they pass on down to us as cliches. You hear some cliches that are maybe have a grain of truth in them, some that seem kind of silly, but they probably began once upon a time as maxims.
Okay.
So those are all sources of the kind of material from which your idea of archetypal stories will draw.
And then with that, the concept of these stories are shared among a community, therefore knowing these stories or participating in the telling of these stories, does that help to identify who you belong to?
Absolutely. For cultures past, it's hard to know what they actually did. The epics are typically upper class culture, military culture, and designed specifically for them. But myths, parables, aphorisms, everybody would have had those. And they do. They give you a sense of belonging, of what you can trust. The stories serve for us as the wisdom of our elders, the ancestors who left that for us. Yeah, and I don't know that we have so many that you can trust anymore. That's one of the reasons why I find your project so interesting, is you're trying to locate something that can help people get a hold on what brings us together rather than what drives us apart.
Yes. Yes. And there's, yeah, some quite interesting complications with that inside the military context, under which we'll get into later in the conversation. But, we're founded underneath a constitution that protects religious liberties, and then we have this interesting aspect of a considerable amount of kind of these epics or myths would deal with theological aspects. So how do you conquer that issue how do you share a story without sharing the theology?
You're quite right. It's such an interesting problem to deal with. What do you do when you are in a culture that hasn't a specific and exclusive shared religion, where people have many religions and can work from many different points of view? One thing that maybe is helpful here is if we can think of the stories as not necessarily promoting religion, but absolutely promoting confronting liminalities. That is, those sort of extreme boundary lines. You go to the beginning of the Renaissance, and what is one of the defining images of the Renaissance? It's the circumnavigation of the globe. Nobody had done that as far as any Europeans knew at the time, and nobody knew if you could do that. So that is a huge liminal boundary. And you get epic tales from the past that are about that, and about the circumnavigation of the globe, or about traveling to far-off lands, because the ocean itself is a liminal boundary. If you go back to Gilgamesh, the first of our epics, and maybe the first tale that we have of recorded human history, the sea serves as a liminal boundary. Forest serves as a liminal boundary. Typically in that culture, mountains could serve as liminal boundaries, partly because they didn't have too many of them. So it was an impressive topographical feature when they found it. So anything that's different from your typical place of living and mode of living represents a boundary. And so crossing that boundary into what's beyond requires courage and commitment, and a sense that you're doing it for just more than just yourself, that you're serving as a sort of cultural representative, crossing into it. I think that's one reason why people like Lord of the Rings so much, why Tolkien appeals. because he's got his characters crossing any number of really dangerous liminal boundaries. Now, a way to think of that in a practical sense, too, is everybody crosses liminal boundaries. The boundary from childhood into adulthood, from being a single person to a married person, through the process of having children, joining an organization like the military, or getting a job with a new company, moving from one place to another to take up a new career or an adventure that a person wants. The crossing of that liminal boundary is pretty much universal, and it's not a-religious, but it doesn't have to conform necessarily to any particular religious thought.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Kind of reminds me of in World War II and the Korean Wars, the Army produced a video series about why we fight, and it was kind of the storyline of why we're engaging in warfare. And to some degree, I can see the intersection there between kind of explaining those big challenges, or why we're, why are we over there, essentially.
Yeah, that goes back to your idea of the importance of narrative. It doesn't necessarily work to tell someone just go here and do what I tell you. It helps a lot if you say, go here and do what I tell you, because you can accomplish this really important result by doing that.
So to my knowledge, a lot of the archetypal stories were created so far back in history that they really started off as oral traditions. So they were shared along campfires, and with writing being so rare at that time, whatever stories were most I want to say true, with the concept of truth being, whatever stories most resembled human experience were ones most often told, and therefore through years and years and years, we in the far past had forgotten the inaccurate stories. So what we got is of the ancient stories were really the ones that were found to be most truthful or meaningful, and that were eventually written down. Is that an accurate assessment of those stories?
Yeah, that's an interesting way to frame it. I guess accurate isn't so much the word I would use as maybe compelling,
Okay.
or persistently applicable. Even though something like the Iliad is so far away from us in culture, everybody, I think, gets interested with what happens with Achilles. And he's the chief soldier of the Greeks, and if he doesn't fight, they won't win. So when Agamemnon gets him angry, he cries and he pouts and he says, "Okay, I'm just going to go sit in my tent, and you can go win the war by yourself, and let's see if you can do it." And they're not going to. So yeah. I think everybody realizes that's pretty bad behavior on the part of both Agamemnon and Achilles to have to start off a fight like that. But also everybody understands it. And I think that's what we look for in those old stories, even though they may be something to which we can't attach meaningful, actionable truth in our time. They still show us about being human. Yes. And the human problems that persistently come up, and that pretty much always will come up, because that's who we are as beings, and every generation has to deal with them. I've written a little bit on the idea of myth as being foundationally about generational succession. The older generation bears us, they raise us. In time, we grow up, we replace them, we bear children, they come up behind us, we raise them as well as we can, we die, and they take our place. And I think the myths very, very often deal with how traumatic that necessarily is, but how necessary it is. Okay. There's always tension. Well, you know this, you're a dad, yes. That you want your children to have the best life possible. You want them to live a good life. You want them, if possible, to live a better life than you did. So you try to set them really good examples, take really good care of them, give them opportunities to learn and move along. So when your kids grow up, there's going to be a kind of tension for them in that they really admire and love mom and dad, but they also can't be just like mom and dad. They have to go out and become their own persons. And so there's tension for the parent in that way, and there's tension for the child in that way too. And then, of course, death is something that we all would probably prefer didn't happen, but it's a part of life in the world, and we have to find ways to deal with that. And even birth is traumatic. back at the time of most of the traditional epics, infant mortality would have been an enormous percentage of births. So many of the myths deal with those issues and traumas and sometimes joys of that process of generational succession. And that's always going to be true for us.
Yeah, and I guess I should bring up a point here that it not only infant mortality, you talk about soldiers surviving battlefield injuries, it's just horrific survivability ratios. So when you went into war, it was much more significant than what we have now.
Yes, and at that time, almost everybody would have had to. Apparently, in the really earliest human societies, there was a military class. But if there's an invasion of your country, your lands, your people, everybody gets involved in that. And mortality would have been off the charts in terms of percentages, and also pretty horrible. If you're dealing with pretty primitive weapons, it's not going to be comfortable to die at the hand of a primitive weapon.
Yes.
Yeah, I think those stories were probably general stories. I also think that's where, why do people love ghost stories and monster stories and that sort of thing? And I think it's, again, that's the liminal boundary to which everybody can go. Everybody goes to the spot of what is not normal but monstrosity. What is that line between life and death? And what about crossing it the other way instead of the way we're accustomed to? And so those would have brought everybody into play with those stories.
So I think my perception, I would say the authors that, at least the current generations that seem to be the most successful with, I want to say creating archetypal stories, but sharing archetypal stories are ones that essentially reached back into the past and then picked up on the common theme. So you look at Tolkien. Tolkien had a very long kind of background in studying various myths and languages from various different worlds. So when he was writing his Lord of the Rings and his larger works, Silmarillion and The Hobbit, he already had these like major themes and storylines running through his mind. And we can look at George Lucas with Japanese myths when he's writing Star Wars, or even to some lesser degree, we can look at the modern series of Harry Potter and say, hey, the reason why these seem to be so successful is they're, I don't want to say a direct copy, but they're heavily drawing upon the influence of these past stories. Would you deem that accurate?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yes, absolutely. I think Tolkien is such an interesting example there, because he had, when he was younger, studied the collected myths of the Brothers Grimm, which was so influential. And I think what struck Tolkien is that if, depending on how you look at it, every name, every person's name, every place name, even to some extent, almost every word has a narrative behind it.
Yes.
You take a name, even before surnames, and surnames tell you so much about where you live, where you come from, what occupation your people did, but even a given name from parent to child bears with it a history, a family history and a cultural history and a meaning that has importance. And he noticed it a lot in place names too, and that really grabbed him. And it spurred him to think narratively about words. And I think his myths, to some extent, came from there. Probably to a large extent even, came from looking into the story that goes with names of people and places, expanding them into something more complete that necessarily lies behind the word.
I think it's in your book, I think you used it's not a direct quote by any means, you used the phrase that Tolkien's intent was to create the archetypal stories for England because they lacked that as a culture, but he did it in a way that almost everybody could instantly latch on to this shared archetypal story.
Mm-hmm. That's what he said. He said his goal was to create a mythology for England. I think part of it was the Germanic peoples in the north had an enormous collection of mythological stories. And the Mediterranean people to the south had an enormous collection of mythical stories. But he thought that the English particularly had lost theirs, and he felt that they needed them. That was part of a sense of identity that they had lost, that they needed. And so he set that as a goal in these stories. Now, of course, he's thinking then more about the Silmarillion than he is about Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. That was what he called the book of his heart.
Yes.
That was the one that meant the most to him, and The Hobbit was kind of an accident, and the Lord of the Rings a kind of follow-up to the accident. So his goal was to create the mythical archetypal stories that people would have to draw on in our time.
Well, and I think he existed in an interesting period, especially for my audience. Tolkien was a veteran of the First World War. He served in the Somme, and if it wasn't for really an illness that removed him, he most likely would have died there. He came back home, and most of his generation, for males, were killed in that war. So needing a sense of identity or a way forward, I think, for him was much more critical than maybe we have now. But it's just quite interesting how his military influences can be sometimes picked up in his book.
Oh gosh, yes. Someone asked him one time, what is the Lord of the Rings about? If you just had to really simplify it, it's like someone asking Jesus to simplify theology, and he says, when it comes down to deepest is love your neighbor as yourself and love God with all your heart. And so he's trying really hard to find something simple that people catch on to. And Tolkien said, what is it about? He said, it's what we always write about. It's about death and confronting death. And I think that absolutely goes back to his World War I experience, because he and so many young men who had no notion of what they were getting into had to face it head on. And he had, there was a group of 4 buddies from high school who had been really close and met together and read things and worked on languages and things like that. And 2 of his best buddies died in the war. And I think that changes you inevitably. And it changed how he looked at everything thereafter. Of course, he was also a really dedicated Catholic, and that had a strong influence on his thinking too. And he didn't want his myths to be specifically Catholic. He's not saying what he's writing is religious in any way. These are secular stories that say something about who we are as a people. That is the English of his generation. So he's working with the influence of the military experience, the influence of his own Catholic thought, and his English landscape and the languages that had influenced him so much. And he's thinking about, I don't want to write a story that's specifically about the war because other people are doing that and doing that well. I want to get something that's what Eliot would call objective correlative, or Eliot around to comment on it. How can I write a story that gives people some sort of sense of what the war was like and what it is like to have been through that without the person having to go through it himself or herself? So it's, I think you hit spot on that's what's motivating that writing. Now, of course, he wrote The Hobbit as a tale for his kids, as a bedtime story that way outgrew that. But The Lord of the Rings is a more serious work dealing with the serious problems of his generation. Very epic-like in that way, not so much epic in form, but epic in terms of, I think, what he wanted to accomplish thematically. And a lot of that means, how can we face up to the way we killed people in World War I? And the fact that we're probably, if war comes again, we're going to do it a lot more and in a lot worse ways yet.
I think out of all of the Lord of the Rings, my favorite character is Samwise Gamgee. And if you understand the British military tradition, officers would have bootmen, so they'd be a lower enlisted soldier that would take care of the officer's equipment while they're, doing battle plans or something more complex.
Yes.
And it's interesting that, even on the battlefield today, we see sometimes where the leader just can't take the stress, breaks down, and it's the tiny guy that shouldn't be the leader that gives the really the voice of courage back to the officer to say, hey, you can do this. And we normally don't see that aspect of war where, hey, if it wasn't for this one private telling the captain that, everything would be okay, that captain may have fallen apart, and then, all these complex things happen or negative things happen. And I think you see it beautifully in kind of that Mount Doom scene in Tolkien where, hey, Frodo, which is supposed to be the kind of the envision of the officer, can't do it anymore. And this little kind of nobody that should have ever been nobody, really should have never left the Shire to begin with, ends up picking up and carrying him and always kind of being that constant voice for motivation.
A number of Tolkien scholars think that the real hero of Lord of the Rings is Sam rather than Frodo, or at least in addition to Frodo. And American audiences often have trouble with that character because they don't like the fact that Sam calls Frodo master. And it goes back to the class relationships of Britain that have changed since World War II somewhat, but that were thoroughly in place yet at the time when Tolkien was at least formulating that story. Of course, it didn't come out till 54, but he had been formulating it for many years, since 1937, since The Hobbit came out. And some American audiences will even think that it's kind of homoerotic, but I didn't think Tolkien would have seen it that way at all, because for him, it's the kind of friendship that two people have when they do come from different classes. One is nominally the servant to the other, but neither is disrespectful to the other. Frodo doesn't treat Sam disrespectfully. Sam wouldn't treat Frodo disrespectfully. And Sam admires Frodo as his employer, as his sort of guide in the world, and a relationship, military relationship, much like what you mentioned. The British called it the Batman. And again, it's the sort of person who helps the officer get through the things that the officer needs to do. And it's they often developed into friendships and important parts of military service. And for people too of that generation, an important part of human service. Tolkien once said, someone was asking him about class, and he said, forgive me for the use of this word, he said, tipping your cap to the squire is damn bad for the squire, but it's damn good for you. And of course, what he's teaching there is a kind of humility, and that we don't have to be in charge of everything. We don't have to be the top person every time. That it's good to know how to lead, but it's also good to know how to serve and how to follow.
And there's an interesting aspect there with the military is, so lower soldiers will salute higher ranking officers, and the officer will always return the salute, because it's not only a sign of, hey, I will follow your leadership, but it's a mark of respect that, yes, hey, I understand that you will follow me.
Yes. I think it's even sad that I guess that we've lost that somewhat, even from basic day-to-day contact with one another. Just passing a person on the street, just a greeting. Yeah. As you go by. I think we're so skittish about one another these days that we forget to recognize one another as fellow human beings and just show, I observe your presence, I respect you in passing, and I express my respect. It's kind of sad that we don't all feel comfortable doing that.
To some degree, I think that the American audience probably had a difficult time connecting with Sam in terms of a lot of people now have just seen the movies, not actually read the actual book. So the adventure of Sam and the Shire after the events kind of got totally removed from the video series, but tells a lot more about the character. And he's really the hero that survived the war, came back, saved his homeland, and then goes off to be kind of the great leader.
Yes.
Other characters.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I often get asked for commentary on the movies, and what did you like and what did you not like? And the main thing that I didn't like is always the same, and it's Jackson's not including the scouring of the Shire at the end. I think that's an essential part. I mean, you have to show the destruction of the ring at Mount Doom, right? But then the story doesn't end there. Jackson said, well, I had a linear story to tell about the acquisition and destruction of the ring, and so that's what I told. And I understand you can't get in every part. It's way too much to put even in 3 long films. But I can't see leaving out the scouring of the Shire for exactly the reason you mentioned. That when you get home, the war's not over. You have to reintegrate, and it's not that easy. And in England too, there was a real big issue about collaborators and profiteers. And that came to light in so many instances after the war. And that's what you see in the Shire. I know there are hobbits who are true to Hobbiton, but there are also hobbits who gave over their loyalty to Sharkey and the orc men who came in. And that's what Sam is essentially the leader of those hobbits who expel that element. Now, Frodo, Freathu, peace, is he's trying to keep a really bad, bloody conflict from happening, and he keeps it from being worse than it is. But what Tolkien wanted to show is there's some things you're going to have to go through, and they're not going to be easy. Yeah, coming home from the war doesn't mean it's over. There's so much yet to negotiate, and that's where Sam really comes through. Tolkien once said in a letter to one of his sons, he said, "You and I share a similar appreciation for the British Tommy." That's the word, which is just the general inductee soldier. They really admired the people they met in the military who lived that life and devoted themselves to the duties necessary in that life. And I think it comes throughout the Lord of the Rings in a lot of different cases, but Sam is probably the primary example.
So while we're talking about the video, another important comment you brought up in your book that I hadn't kind of sat back and from a scholarly aspect taken a look between the differences between the videos and the actual books, but it's this circular pattern. So inside the book you see Frodo has to be torn out of like several different kind of homes. So you get this repeating of major themes over and over and over again until it kind of becomes secondhand, like, okay, we understand this connection with the character, but when you're doing a film, you don't have time to do that linear connection, so you lose that reinforcement of kind of this repeated theme or trend. I thought that was quite interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a number of pieces that you get when you study the books that you can't get from the film, just because there's no easy way to include them. And Jackson, the one that a lot of people get upset about is his not including Tom Bombadil, because everybody loves Tom Bombadil, but then you can see why he wouldn't. First of all, it's a side narrative. It's an antechapel on your tour through a cathedral. You know, you want to get some of them so you know what they're like, but you can't get everything. It's too much. And Tom Shippey's the scholar who first brought up this idea, at least of those I've read, of that Frodo goes through a number of homely houses on his way. He stops here and there in a number of different places. So I think there's reason for that, and to remind you that that's still where Frodo and the hobbits want to be, and it's the place they have to try to get back to. The other thing, too, is I got this idea of the world of the text from Paul Ricoeur, a French theorist, literary theorist. And I think the key to the success of a story like this one, like The Lord of the Rings, is the building of the world of the text. I'll give you an example. My sister is a wonderful high school English teacher, and she sent me an email one day, and there was no small talk, no dear brother, how are you? Nothing like that in there. It had only one line in the email, and she said, "I want to be in Middle Earth." And I thought, how many of us feel that way? That's one of the things that brings us back to the book. And Tolkien does that by giving us all those asides. Everybody wants to visit the Prancing Pony. Everybody wants to be at the tree party, with Bilbo for the departure of the ring. Everybody wants to go to Rivendell and meet Elrond. There's so many wonderful places that aren't part so much of a linear story, but that fill out the world, and it gives you a big, diverse world that's worth saving. So it's worth the sacrifice that all of the different beings in that world go through to save it.
Well, I think Tolkien writes in quite an interesting way, and sometimes this writing style isn't copied by modern writers in the terms of you discover the world as you go through the story, compared to if you pick up most fantasy books now, it's the introductory chapter that really grabs your chapter or your attention, and then chapter 2 is like the background of the world and the whole entire environment, and then the story continues in chapter 3, where you don't see that in Tolkien. And you even see like conversations inside Tolkien where they reference characters or stories that the full story never gets told. So, you know, characters are referencing each other and they're sharing whatever brief clips or references to other people, and you're like, I don't know who they're talking about.
Who that is.
Or what does it mean to reference whatever the Queen's cats versus, you know. But that's how we would truly be if we're traveling across Europe and we're encountering other people. You know, they're going to make cultural references that will never get explained, nor will we take the time to ask them, like, what did you really mean by this?
Yes. Well, if you did take the time, you'd never get home.
Yes.
Because you'd find so many wonderful stories to explore that you'd spend the rest of your life going after all of them. Yeah, I think that's that goes back to the idea of the archetypal story. Now, when you and I first talked I mentioned to you Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces.
Yes.
That is a book that I highly recommend for your audience. It has influenced me a lot. It has its problems. It's not a perfect book, but it lays out the idea of the archetypal story. Now, it may not really be, but that was Campbell's idea when he wrote it. He looked at myths and legends and stories from all over the world, and he carved out this, what he saw as an essential narrative that underlies almost all of our great stories. And it involves a lot of asides. You know, so some of it is linear and some of it isn't. But I think the alinearity of it at times comes from, that's again the process of living. You know, not everything in our lives is linear. You go to grade school and you stay for a few years, right? Until you're ready to move on. Then you go to high school and you stay for a few years, and then you go on to what's next for you, whatever that may turn out to be. So it isn't linear, and the stories often work better for us, engage us more fully by avoiding the simple linear narrative. This is Maureen Murdoch's book, The Heroine's Journey. And she said the problem with Campbell's monomyth, the one story, is that it's maybe not the monomyth, but maybe the male monomyth. So she explored the idea of, could there be a female monomyth? And what she came to was that it looks a lot the same, but she thinks of the female monomyth as being much more circular and much less linear.
Yes.
I think it would be fair also to, not just by gender, but to go culture by culture. Now, Campbell did that to some extent. He's looking at cultures from all over the world, but even to look at cultural nuance in what that archetypal story looks like. I think we enjoy them more. Something like Gilgamesh doesn't give you nearly all the asides that you want, and there's no way to get it back now because that's from a long, long time ago. That's 3rd millennium BC. But we still love the story, but it misses a little bit of that fill-in that really makes it feel palpable and true and fully human. And Tolkien does that about as well as anybody could do it, I think.
I have yet to pick up a copy of that heroine book. It's sitting in my queue and my Amazon book list. But it brings up a very kind of timely topic with the military in terms of, well, I think that the feminine hero myth has more degrees of variance than the male, and we're, especially now that we're opening up combat arms to female soldiers, having kind of some type of archetypal story to say, like, this is how you can fit in on the front lines, where we've never had you in history there before. Now there might be some obscure references to maybe 1 or 2 individuals on a battlefield, but never in mass. It's how do you create a storyline that's true and accurate and that could stand the test of time when you've just started and you really don't know what that archetypal myth is.
Yes. Yeah, I think the danger is just slipping a female hero into a male story. And it's okay. It's something, at least. I'm a big fan of the Black Panther movie that came out not too long ago, again, for the same reason, that the typical superhero has been white and male. And what we need to do is diversify that story and let everybody participate in it. You know, everybody has a hero story to tell of some sort, and they may be different, and we kind of need them to be different, because not everybody can cross every liminal boundary. You know, it's just not possible. So you have to find a story that appeals to you and becomes possible for you and allows you to become a complete version of yourself through following it.
I think that's a great segue. We'll jump into the next question. Could you tell us some of the exemplars of leadership found in archetypal stories, to include the Tolkien's work, both positive and negative in terms of leadership?
Yeah, sure. There's tons of them. In The Power of Myth, I'll go back to Joseph Campbell again. There's a wonderful interview series that he did based on that book with Bill Moyers. And Bill Moyers says, well, why do so many of the ancient stories tell these stories about heroes and leaders? And Campbell said, well, because that's what's interesting to read about. Those are the stories that give you sort of the wildest range of possibilities. And so that's, I think, what Tolkien set out to do as well. If you can find distinct differences, and it really comes down to one issue. Like, to say, to exemplify good leaders, you have Gandalf and Aragorn. What makes them good leaders? Yes, they're brave. Yes, they're true to their purpose. Yes, they're kind. Yes, they remain composed and they deal with the most difficult circumstances they could face. The thing that brings them together is that they believe in and they practice free will. And this is for Tolkien a big idea in religious terms as well. This is something that Christians often forget. People will say, well, what is God's purpose for me? And they have a notion that God wants them to be a piano teacher, or an owner of a business, or a lawyer, or whatever it may be. But according to deep down Christian theology, God gives us free will to make choices. Now, God doesn't choose for us. We have free will to choose. And so Gandalf and Aragorn are most particularly about making sure that the beings of Middle-earth retain free will and can choose for themselves. On the other side, coming down from Morgoth, you have Sauron, and then ultimately Saruman too. They want to take away free will. They want to be in charge. They want to tell everybody what to do, and they want everybody to do exactly what they tell them. That, for Tolkien, is evil. Free will is good. Removal of free will is evil. He makes it quite plain like that. So the theme, you can't miss that theme if you look at his heroes and leaders. In other sources, it gets a little more varied depending on time and place. Probably the one that has affected Western culture the most, as far as I can tell, even more than Homer's epics, is Virgil's Aeneid. And Aeneas is on the losing side in the Trojan War. So he has to try to survive and leave. But his job in the world isn't done. The gods give him a task, and it's to found what will one day become Rome. And so Aeneas sets off after it. And he doesn't always behave perfectly along the way. In fact, he causes quite a good deal of sorrow along the way. But the gods won't let him forget his purpose. and so Aeneas devotes himself to following that purpose, and to give the Romans, when Virgil was writing it, his idea is to write an epic about Roman virtue. Now, what does it mean to be a good Roman? And you get it, you get the answer in the epithet that Virgil gives Aeneas. He calls him pious Aeneas, pious Aeneas. And for Virgil and for the Roman at that time, it means piety to the gods, but also to your family, to your community, to whatever task you have to do in the world, and even in a sense toward your enemy. Not to treat your enemy disrespectfully, not to kill unnecessarily, and to set a good example as a soldier. And those were the Roman virtues. That's what Rome wanted to communicate to its soldiers, and it's what made Rome so formidable as an international power for so long. Is the Roman soldier and even the Roman citizen knew what it meant to be a good Roman. You had those virtues laid out for you, and you could follow them. And I think that's why I think the Christian world wanted so badly for Virgil to be Christian, because so much of what he says fits in really comfortably with Christian thought. And that's part of what kept Virgil in the reading pipeline for everybody all along when a lot of other works faded from intellectual centerpiece for a while, because it's hard to find a fault with a belief in piety as a virtue, because it doesn't, we might take it in our own time that it denies your personal expression, but Aeneas gets that too. He gets to have that too, but he never forgets that because of the position he's in, he has duties to all the people around him, and he does his very, very best to carry it out. Not with perfection, not without occasional failure, but with persistence and remembering what it is and always coming back to it. And that's one of the real foundational works, I would say, even more than the Iliad and the Odyssey. You know, the Iliad says, what's my place in the world? Well, for Achilles, it's to be the greatest soldier of his time. And he does. He lives up to that. The problem with it is, for him, it means live fast, die young, and leave a good-looking corpse. You know, he doesn't get to live the long life. So, but the question is, that time, if you want your memory to live in the world, because your body won't, and you have no sense that your soul is necessarily going to go to a good place. So you leave people with a memory of your heroism and your abilities. Now, after that comes the Odyssey. Odysseus takes up the question of, okay, I've been there, done that. I've done my military duty. I didn't really want to do it, but I did it. But then having done that, what do I do? And the answer is get home. Get home, take care of your family as well as you can, get your place back in the world. Won't be easy, but that's your job now. And I think, boy, that's got to speak to soldiers everywhere from every time. So many of these old stories give you what you need to do in the world at that time that your culture requires of you and is trying to understand how to employ in practical living.
Well, I find it interesting because you bring up the fact that the heroes or characters misbehave at times, and I can't think of really in either Arthurian myth or even in Tolkien's work where you have a character that's, I wouldn't say a character arc, but doesn't have character flaws. And to some degree the story is learning how to compensate for the character flaws, but it's not like modern stories where you get over it. And sometimes you have characters that will always, even though they're doing good in the world, will always have some type of negative behavior or association around them. And I think that connects us to the kind of humanity of those stories a lot more than kind of the kind of comic book characters you see in modern times.
Yes, I worry a little bit about the comic book culture. If it goes too far, I think on one level they're great. They're tons of fun. It becomes a really good hobby for people. But it's not, as a rule, a good model. Although you go back to the beginning of the comic books. Like when I was a kid, I turned up a reprinted copy of the very, very beginning of the Batman series. And it was dark. You know, it wasn't, this was not happy superhero story. This is all kinds of trouble from which this story comes at the beginning. You know, it's very urban noir early on in that series. And I thought that's good. That's a good piece of the story to tell and not necessarily a piece to leave out. But it's also good to give your characters a chance to show a certain kind of humanity and a certain kind of completeness. In recent years, I've been doing a little less scholarship and a little more fiction writing. And I've done some novels under a pen name. And in one of the novels, the hero is a veteran of World War I. And he comes back to the U.S. And when he comes back, all his family have either died or disappeared, and he has nobody to come back to. So he doesn't know quite what to do with himself. And he's never been wealthy, so he tries to find work. And he does the best he can, but there's no steady work. And then the depression hits, and he's really stuck. So he goes. He has one family member he can locate in Duluth, Minnesota, and he goes seeking her an aunt. And along the way, he just accidentally hops off the train one day, figuring to get some food and a place to sleep. But he finds himself in the midst of a ghost story, and he has the option to leave or to stay and try to help, even though the people don't want an outsider to try to help. But he stays. And you think, well, why in the world would this guy have a sense of obligation? And he doesn't even know. But he just feels as though maybe I have no particular other thing to go to. Maybe I can help with this problem. And so he stays. Now, one of the problems that I got, or one of the comments I got from readers, was one person said, oh, your main character, he's just too good. And my answer was, well, if you remember, the first time he sees the ghost, he runs.
Yeah.
He doesn't stay, and that ghost is terrifying. And he doesn't stay, he runs. And I think probably, given a similar circumstance, all but the very, very bravest of us would do just the same thing. And so, yeah, I think that's sort of my process of humanizing that hero. You know, not making him I wanted to make him a good person, because I also don't believe in undermining our heroes too much. I think it's good to show that being a good person is hard but possible. And, you know, we can make an effort to do that. All of us can. So I tried to create a person who was like that, but at the same time, braver and more capable than I am, or than I would be, because that's what's interesting to me. So yeah, I think the hero stories are still great and really good for us and really healthful. And I think it's good to have as many variations of that sense of a hero as you can, so everybody has something to latch onto. You know, I just got a nice note from a former student who's off to graduate school in Chicago, and you know, he's a small town kid, and here he is now in the midst of the big city all by himself. And to me, that is so brave. And it takes a lot of commitment, and you're taking a chance with your life, and it's something new, but he just threw himself right into it. And I admire the heck out of him for being able to do that and choosing to do that. To me, that's also a hero story, just a different one.
Yeah. One of the most interesting aspects of the hero stories that I really enjoy, and one of the major reasons why I'd love to bring back archetypal stories into the military, is a lot of the times the hero kind of lives up to the amount of perfection that's humanly possible, but they fail in some degree. But when they come back home, they never seem to be able to forgive themselves. So you see this with Frodo, where at the last possible moment, all he had to do is like open his hand and the war could have been over, but he can't let go of the ring. And you also see this in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, where
Yes.
you know, he's not honest. But those characters, by far, you could say, were maybe the most challenged of the heroes, or most perfect of the heroes, but neither one of them can forgive themselves, even though they, in the end, made it to the kind of state of victory that they're aiming for. And
Yes.
I think that has a lot of truth, or could act as a lot of preventive medicine for soldiers, like, hey, you're going to go off to the war, you're going to do some terrible things, bad stuff's going to happen, you are going to have moments where you are not as perfect as you wish you would in hindsight, but coming back home, you got to learn how to forgive yourself for being human. And yeah, it just makes me wonder if those characters are written in there just to remind ourselves that, hey, the heroes should be able to forgive themselves, or
Yes.
there's always going to be some degree of regret that, you know, don't get overly concerned if you come back home with this kind of idea that you always had some type of fault.
That's such an important point. Frodo has post-traumatic stress, as you would expect he would. And I do think Tolkien was a big fan of Gawain and the Green Knight. And I think he's thinking of that exactly, because Gawain refuses to give up, or fails anyway, to give up the sash. And the sash doesn't work anyway. There's nothing to it. It's a test for him. That's what it's for. So what he learns is, and this is exactly what the Green Knight tells him at the end. He says, you're not perfect, but you did as well as a knight can do. You did as well as a person can do. You should be really happy about that. But Gawain is forever troubled by the fact that he can't be perfect. And so the story is, yes, very much about that. And Lord of the Rings is very much about that. May I recommend a movie for your audience? If they haven't seen it, this is a favorite of mine, and it just captivates me every time I see it. It's called The Best Years of Our Lives.
Yes.
Have you seen it?
Yes. It's
yeah.
a movie.
From 1946. Yeah, the story begins with three military men coming back at the end of World War II. One is Air Force, one is Army, one is Navy. So they do it on purpose, right, to give you a sort of a diversity of backgrounds. And each of them comes home with some kind of trauma to deal with. And they were, during the war, they were good soldiers. They don't have anything to feel bad about. They did their duty. They were brave. They were always there. They did the very, very best they could. They suffered from what they experienced. And when they get home, it's hard for them. And it's hard. Another piece that movie builds in is it's hard for the families too. And don't forget that. The families really, really want to welcome the person home, but they don't always know what to do either, because they haven't been through that and they can't understand what it's like to be there. So they have to try to help reintegrate the person. The person has to try to reintegrate. And I just think that's it's one of the early movies to do that in a really serious way. But to manage to do it also in a hopeful way. Highly recommend.
Oh yeah. That movie deserves its own video just because there's so many great aspects.
That might be right.
One of the main characters is a double amputee that actually lost his arms in combat. So having Hollywood embrace a veteran like that and allow the veteran to tell his actual story on screen is just incredible.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's one case is an obvious physical injury. One of the other characters comes home an alcoholic, and how do you deal with that? Another one, he was as one of the other characters in the film refers to him. He was one of the glory boys of the Air Force, flying in a bomber, and he comes home and there's no job for him, because there was nothing he learned in the war that translates into a civilian skill specifically. And so he has to struggle to get a job. And he's also haunted by the death of one of his friends when his plane got shot up. So there's a wonderful diversity of stories in there. It doesn't cover everything it possibly could cover, but gosh, it covers a lot for one little film.
Yeah. One of the main characters is a banker, and he has this returning veteran walk in and say, "Hey, I want a loan for a farm," and they ask like, "Hey, what are you offering in collateral?" And essentially what would have been a young private says, "I'll give you my word, I'll make it work." And then the loan agent says, "Okay, we'll give you a loan." And then the bank's looking at him like, "How did you do this? He has no collateral." And he goes, "Well, I trust soldiers, and the soldier said he would make it happen, so we gave him the money because he's going to make it happen," which is...
Yeah. And he essentially, too, kind of teaches the bankers a lesson by saying, what are we here for if it isn't to help people like that? Yeah.
So another interesting correlation that I have with working with archetypal stories in the military is, and I see a parallel between Aragorn and Gandalf and King Arthur and Merlin, is you have kind of the Aragorn, Merlin, you're learning how to become kind of this ultimate warrior, kind of young generation, and then on the opposite side of the house, the wizards, which comes from a word literally meaning knowledge.
Yes.
It's kind of the older generation. How do you function as the mentor? And it's interesting in the military context is knowing when and gracefully transitioning from kind of that Aragorn mindset into the Gandalf mindset. Like, when do we try to hand off reins and realize, like, hey, I'm not going to be the frontline combat troops anymore, but I need to be the helpful wizard in the background mentoring that next generation. or at least correctly aligning ourselves to where we fit in society and what character most appropriately matches our need in these archetypal stories.
Yes. Some of the characters in Lord of the Rings will actually ask Gandalf, why don't you just fix things?
Yes.
And he says, that's not what I'm here for. He says that, and he says that because he can't take away their free will. This is their job. And he's not here forever to fix Earth and to fix the errors of all the different creatures on the Earth. He's there to teach us how to do better with it, and including Aragorn. And Aragorn has to regain his confidence. You know, he's afraid that his line of leadership has run out, and he doesn't know if he can do the task that's ahead of him. So he needs that too. And that's essentially what Gandalf is there for, to be able to say, you know, this is not my job to fix things for you. It is my job to help you find what you need to find in yourself to do what you need to do. Yeah, it's a little bit like teachers, I guess, in a way. We have this awful cliche, people who can do, people who can't teach. But it isn't really true, because if you couldn't do it, you wouldn't be a teacher to begin with. And you have to have gone through it. You have done it. Maybe you can't do it quite anymore the way you did then, or maybe you continue to do it and you're trying to help other people learn how to do it too. You know, whatever it is, from computer programming to playing a violin, to writing a book, whatever it may be. And Tolkien gives a really wide range of possibilities for what people do, for where they find their place. You know, in a way, Tom Bombadil is kind of an alternative to Gandalf. He's a little bit like Gandalf in being a little higher order of being than human beings and hobbits and dwarves and the other mortal beings of Earth. But he can't solve their problems either. He can help them through one difficult spot where he has particular influence on what goes on. But he can't go with them. He can't destroy the ring. He can't take the ring. For one thing, because it's just not interesting to him. It's not his way of looking at the world. So Tolkien sorts out a whole big world of options for where does a person fit into that thing. You know, there's kind of interesting parallel too in a lot of the Arthurian materials, and it's even in the Iliad, where when the soldiers are in melee, you know, when they're in the midst of a battle, they don't go about just randomly killing. They tend to sort out an opponent who's appropriate to them. You know, like a knight, a well-armed knight, isn't going to go out and kill a peasant foot soldier because it's not a match. It would be yes, yes, yeah. It would be immoral. It would be unethical. It would be ungodly. That is not the knight's job. And even in the Iliad, you see some of that. You see soldiers who look for other soldiers on the battlefield who are good matches for them. So they feel like, okay, this is a fair and upright fight between us. And the winner is, in this instance, the better man. And that's another kind of leadership. I don't know that that's a good way to carry over thinking into the modern battlefield. I wouldn't think so. That's for a military person to decide, not for me. But it was a lesson of that time, both in the ancient world and in the Middle Ages with the King Arthur stories. You know, even early in the King Arthur stories, King Arthur himself is very briefly the world's greatest knight. And it isn't for very long because he needs to become a great king instead. He has a different task ahead of him. You know, the Beowulf story is rather the other way around. Beowulf wants to remain a warrior, a soldier. That's who he is. And he becomes king not because he wants to, but because it falls to him ultimately to do that. But he's not especially happy with it. So the stories give you a kind of range of things. And what can I do in the world to fill what God or the gods have, or nature has made of me, and to do something for my fellow humans and my fellow creatures?
There's an interesting correlation between, I think, Beowulf and Aragorn, where the question is, if you're selecting kings, obviously you don't pick the guy that wants to be king, you pick the guy that would be good at being king, but the guy would probably be good at being king probably has no or little interest in it because they have doubts about whether or not they'd be good kings, and then it's usually thrust upon them. And yeah, some interesting thoughts there.
It is. But leadership is such an interesting problem. And for me, it has always been a real conundrum because you have to be willing to be led and to lead. And both of them, for some of us, can be kind of hard to do. To take someone else's actions under your judgment and say, here's what I need you to do now. Gosh, that's an enormous responsibility. And a person has to, I think, practice for a long time, study for a long time, learn for a long time, and gain confidence about how to do that. And then a person taking an order ideally would have to have good confidence in the person giving it. Maybe that's a hard piece of your current project, is to figure out how to think about that and how to sort that out and make everybody comfortable with the process of, in some cases I am led, and in other cases I lead. How do I teach myself how to be good with that?
Which is interesting because I think Tolkien really, so we tend to think of leadership as a static line in the military. So you have your generals and, all the way down to the privates. So the generals tell you what to do, and then the privates eventually execute after the message has been passed down. But you see a much more dynamic version of leadership, especially when you have the Fellowship of the Ring. So you have a lot of strong characters that would have been leaders. So you have Boromir that would have been a leader, proven combat commander. You have Aragorn that, the future next king. You have Gandalf there. And even to some degree you have Frodo making decisions about where to go. But it's interesting that at no time, especially when they're going through like Moria, there's not a single leader that says this is what we're going to do. So at times it's Aragorn making decisions, at times it's Gandalf giving advice and making decisions, and at times it's okay, we're going to default down to Frodo. Frodo, you're ultimately going to have to decide for us. Where you put that in the context of a military unit, it takes a special type of unit to say, hey, I'm the leader, but I'm not the expert, so you give the advice, and then we're going to do whatever you say. I might still hold that commander position, but I'm going to default to someone else, and knowing when to do that and when not to.
I wonder if that's one of the reasons why I do sometimes talk with military veterans who say, in a lot of ways, that was the best time in their lives, and I wonder if it doesn't come back to that sense of it's like having the good fortune to be part of a loving family. That's a good part of your life, and then also to be part of a unit where you trust the fellow members of your unit because you believe in them, their abilities, and in a pinch you can defer to them or they can defer to you. That would be a wonderful experience in this way.
This is a good segue. So you shared a story with me on email that something I had missed. So in the kind of final big battle of the Lord of the Rings, the Battle of the Black Gate, you have Aragorn saying, hey, we're going to basically go on a suicidal mission to just be a distraction. And he had troops that basically said, hey, I can't do this. But he finds a way to save face and give them something else to do. So yes. Everyone is still participating in the mission.
Yes.
Can you tell that story?
Yes, I since we talked about that, I marked it in the book, and it's not a very long passage, but it's significant. It's in the chapter called "The Black Gate Opens," and these soldiers have gone out of Minas Tirith together to go nominally to face Sauron and the forces of Mordor on their own territory. So most of these people have had experience. They're not necessarily career soldiers, but everybody's been through some difficult battles and some difficult times. And so this is a fairly small group. And even along the way, they've had to give up some of the soldiers to guard certain passes or certain dangerous spots that they need covered. And of course, the problem is they are now all together, this group, approaching the source of the worst evil in that world. This is where it lives, and this is where its power is greatest. And of course, then there are the ring wraiths overhead, and all of the danger and horror that they imply. And some of the soldiers along the way, through no fault that any human might not experience, can't do it. They just they go limp. And Tolkien would have seen that in the trenches in France during World War I. And so Aragorn says to them, he says, okay, I understand why you can't go on with this. He said, but he's a little bit tough on him. He says, don't lose your honor completely. He says, I'm going to give you the option of another task that you can take up and do instead that's possible for you. And this is a way to save your honor and still do something that's helpful to the immediate cause. And some of them feel bad about taking it up. Some of them feel joyful about taking it up because they realize this is still a task that takes courage and knowledge and commitment, and they can do that. That's within their capacity to do it. And they go off to do it. So the soldiers who go on to the gate of Mordor are fewer than they were, but they are all now absolutely steeled to the purpose at hand. So in a way, it's probably a little better for everybody that it works out that way. So it's thoughtful on Aragorn's part. It isn't exclusively kind, but is probably about as kind a thing as he could offer at the time. And it does what Tolkien does so often show, that not everybody's up to every task. And we as humans have to understand that and work with that.
So as a man that's just studied Tolkien far more than detail than I have, was there anything about Tolkien that you found like really surprising in your studies or something that caught you off guard?
Yeah, that's such, that's, of all of the things you gave me to think about ahead of time, that's the one that has puzzled me the most. Because when you read, you can develop expectations of what's ahead, a little bit like solving a murder mystery. You want to know who done, and you try to follow the clues and work all that out. Or you can try not to do that as you read. Let the story unfold for you as it goes. Probably the most surprising thing for me was how much he stresses free will. That's one of the big themes all through his work, is the absolute essential piece. It's in Dante. I think a lot of people don't realize that in Divine Comedy, you go through Inferno, Hell, Purgatorio, Purgatory, Paradiso, Paradise. And what Dante explains is all of the souls who are there because they want to be there. And you figure, how could that be? But that's how it works out. And when you read Shakespeare plays, Shakespeare's doing the same thing. He says everything comes down, the essential process of being human comes down to free will and the choices you make. And it was interesting to me to see Tolkien do the same thing, that the stories, even in the myths, come down to the choices that the various creatures make, why they make them, how they make them, and what they do once they've made them. But Tolkien keeps coming back to that. And I think he probably was stressing, and again, sorry for going the religious route here, a real specific religion rather than something more general. But he was after this idea that the essential piece of being a good Christian is free will and making choices for yourself, not making choices because of fear, not making choices because a hierarchy tells you one thing or another, but making the choice because you feel like that's the right thing to do. You think that's the right thing to do. It seems to you deep down it's the right thing to do, and that's why you do it. So I guess I maybe wouldn't have expected him to do that so persistently. I should have expected that, knowing who he was and what his background was. But he keeps coming back to that as an essential theme. I guess the other maybe thing that surprised me is, and people who don't read Tolkien, academic colleagues who don't read Tolkien, will often ask me, why do you teach in your classes, or why do you talk with your students about these tales that are just for little boys? And I have to say, well, that it may seem like that to you, but that doesn't actually turn out to be true. And if you these days, if you go to a meeting of Tolkien scholars, you will find at least as many women as you do, and you will find people of color, and you will find people of different orientations, because everybody seems to find a place in Tolkien. And I think part of that is Tolkien doesn't willingly make judgments. He puts characters out and lets them make choices. And he might well judge the choice as good or bad, but he's awfully careful about passing any judgment on the character.
It's quite interesting. The people that have told me that Tolkien doesn't write strong female characters, I always look at them and say, well, you haven't read the books, because he wrote some incredibly powerful female characters, whether it's Lady Lorien, one of the most powerful of the elves, or Eowyn, you know, the female Rohirrim that took on the armor of a man, really faced the king of the ring wraiths, a character that had killed, well, countless really critically important characters, especially if you read the larger Silmarillion. So just to say, you know, here's a female doing what no man could do on a battlefield. And some take offense to her character arc in terms of, after the war's done, she basically says, hey, I just want to be a healer and mother, and I just want to go back to live a normal life. And some of that context might have just been the social norms of kind of Tolkien's day, because how do you go back and live a normal life in the 1920s is different than the modern world. But there's definitely some amazing characters in there.
Another way to look at that too with Eowyn is she makes a choice.
Yeah.
And that's the important thing. She makes a choice to go to war, and then she makes a different kind of choice at the end of the war. The important thing is the free will to make the choice. You know, it's the same thing with Galadriel. She's faced with the greatest question of free will when Frodo offers her the ring. And it's hard for her to turn down, because she could turn the war around once she has it. But she does. She turns down the opportunity for that kind of power because she realizes that's a really bad thing to have. And here's another kind of interesting wrinkle with female characters. Often when I work with younger writers who are just beginning to learn how to write stories and to try to determine what they want to write, a lot of the women want to write good, strong female characters. And I say that's always good. But remember to let your female characters be human too, just like male characters. You know, the possibility has to be there that they can do bad things, or otherwise they can't really do good things. That's a point that Milton makes thoroughly in Paradise Lost, that along with the capacity to make a good choice comes the capacity to make a bad one. If you can't make a bad one, you can't make a good one. And it has to be a matter of choosing good, not falling into it accidentally. So if you, characters like Shelob and Ungoliant, those are female characters. Those are very bad.
Oh yeah, I guess I never took the time.
And you know, they're right there with Sauron and Morgoth and the dangerous characters. You know, they're monstrous. And so Tolkien, in writing those characters, isn't picking on women or female characters. He's showing that female characters, like male characters, must have the opportunity to choose between good and evil. That's free will, and that's what makes them real.
So other than the books that you've recommended throughout this interview, do you have any additional ones that you'd recommend to the audience?
Oh, I made a little list. I guess the problem for me is, you know, from our discussions, the epics are the archetypal stories. Those are the ones you kind of need to go back to, but they're not for everybody. They're difficult reading, and you often want to, if you do read them, you at least want to have someone you can consult about how to read them and certain kinds of things that go on in them that you might not understand without some scholarly help. I can't avoid recommending Beowulf. It's a favorite of mine, and it's not that long, but you might need to talk to somebody about it, because there's some parts in it that are really confusing and that you won't understand without, you know, you're having to read a translation unless you're really good with languages and learn the Old English, and translations will make mistakes, so that it's easy to find yourself misled about what's going on in them. But if you want someone who really struggles with ideas of heroism and leadership and is so devoted to doing well, but finds the difficult spots. Beowulf is a really good one to read. Among all the epics I mentioned, the Aeneid, that's so important to Western culture. A person wants to read that at some time, but again, you want to read it with help, especially a good Latinist who can help you with any sort of language issues that come up. Here's some others, and these are just thoughts. I don't know that I'd so much recommend them as just throw them out for people's consideration. Do you know Joe Haldeman's The Forever War?
I have not read that one yet, but yes.
1974 sci-fi, won lots and lots of awards. Not everybody likes it because it brings up some really difficult things, but it has a main character who is really devoted to duty and comes back from war to a really different world than the one he left. So it's kind of useful in a lot of ways that way. This isn't sort of an old standard, but Stephen Crane's The Red Badge of Courage. You know, the character loses his courage at one point and then gets it back. And that's kind of what we were talking about, you know, what do you do when you make an error? You have to be able to try to find a way to forgive yourself and fix it, right? And do the right thing. So I might throw that into the list. Let's see. Oh, I asked a couple colleagues who, school doesn't start till next week, classes, so I was poking around trying to ask some colleagues what they would recommend. And one of my colleagues recommended British historian Paul Johnson's book, Churchill. He finds Winston Churchill one of the most interesting figures of the 20th century as someone who converted from, or moved through the process of soldiering and ultimately moving into government, and really made a heck of a lot of blunders early on. He was not an awfully good soldier, but he became the politician that England desperately needed in his time. And it's not a long book, but it does have some pretty interesting things to say about Churchill. I took down a quotation from that book, actually. He said about Churchill, none holds more lessons, especially for youth. And no persons he found of all those with whom he'd worked in his historical and biographical studies, he found nobody who can better teach young people than what he can say about Churchill. So that might be one to think about. I bet you know this one. Tim O'Brien, The Things They Carried.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a biggie because it really humanizes everybody, all the soldiers in a different way. He has another one that's kind of strange and surreal called Going After Cacciato.
I don't know that one.
It's kind of weird, but it's fun to read. I guess in some ways I'd go back to the old standard Sun Tzu and the Art of War. For a while, business people were really latching on to that. And it's actually full of strategy that you can think about in a lot of different ways. So it's an old saw, you know, it's from what, 2,500 years ago or so, but it might still be worth a look for people. One that I found kind of interesting, this is not a war story, but it incorporates war stories, is Robert Graves' book, Goodbye to All That, from 1929. Graves wrote a lot about myth, for instance, too, and he did some fiction and some poetry. But this is the book of his that stood out for me because it's an account of a person in that generation who grew up not expecting what happened in war, finding themselves in it, and then trying to process their experience of it in some way that they could still go on and be productive and live good lives. And I found his was, for me at least, a really good example of that. This is a really good one too, and it's another kind of odd one. It won't take very long to read, but if your audience could pick up, and you can find this even online, a copy of an Old English poem called The Battle of Maldon, M-A-L-D-O-N, The Battle of Maldon. It's after Beowulf, maybe the most significant of Old English poems.
Okay.
It's maybe 4 or 5 pages long, and you can find good translations of it. You don't have to read the Old English. But it has maybe the greatest line of all of English poetry in it, which I'm going to tell you in just a minute. But it's an account of a local alderman who kind of calls up the local farmers, and there's not many soldiers among them, but he makes a little quick order militia to face some Vikings who had been harrying up and down the coast. And he stops them there, and he faces off against them. And they suffer a terrible defeat. So it looks like maybe one of the worst blunders of all time, one of the worst military blunders of all time. On the other hand, history shows that after that, those raids slowed down. They weren't so bad, they didn't happen so much, and eventually they petered out. So it's one of those poems, you read it and you think, was this a good idea? Or was this the worst idea ever? So it gives you that conundrum to ponder over, and there's not an easy answer to it. But the great line in it, maybe I think the best in all of English poetry. Here's just an easy translation of it. Resolve must be the firmer, heart the keener, courage the greater, as our strength fails us.
Okay, I've heard something roughly similar to that before.
Yeah, it's such a good line, and it's applicable to so many things in life. You got to, as your strength begins to fail, that's when you really got to call up whatever other abilities you have to try to deal with whatever the moment presents you. So it's not, again, a little scholarly background helps with it, but it's a highly underrated poem in our time and gives you really a lot to think about. Oh, I mentioned the people who read Lord of the Rings, or people maybe who have just seen the movie and not read it, shouldn't leave out the Scouring of the Shire. That's where the hobbits steel themselves to a little battle they need to fight, and that's a big one. Is that an okay list?
Oh, yes. But there's one other book that you forgot to mention. So you talked about your novel, but you didn't give us your pen name or the title of the book.
I have a copy of it here that I'll hold up. This is the novel. The title of it is Whiskalo Chukalo, and that is actually the name of the ghost that the character has to meet. And Edward S. Lewis is the pen name I use for writing some fiction. So if people are interested in following the story of Hank Peck, who's a World War I vet who's trying to find his place in the world during the Great Depression, that's it. I have another book too that people might find interesting, but the problem with it is it's out of print these days. But if anybody were interested in it, I can probably turn up an electronic copy and send it to them. Okay. It's Beowulf for Business, which drew lots of laughter when I published this. There's all kinds of books out there for leadership studies and for people in business. I think I saw something called Shakespeare for Leaders or Shakespeare for Managers or something like that a few years ago. And I wrote this because Beowulf actually has tons of ideas for leaders in any field. It would be great for military leaders, I should think, but also for people in business or for people who are trying to figure out how to direct their lives. There's lots of advice in there, real practical advice about how to make your way through difficult and confusing and sometimes scary situations. So sadly for me, it's out of print, but I can try to find a way to make it available if anybody turns out to be interested in it. So those are maybe the ones that would be most applicable.
Okay. So if you have time, I have one last question that was asked by a member of my audience. So I think we can see it's in concern with Tolkien in the Inklings. Yes. And I think you can see the influence on C.H. Lewis from Tolkien. That's fairly obvious. Yes. But the question is, do you know of any major influences from the other members of the Inklings that affected the way that Tolkien wrote? I know it's kind of a complicated question.
Yes, I think so. Lewis's brother, Marnie, they called him, was a historian. And I do think that Tolkien gained some probably from at least talking with him, because they all used to get together and read to one another from whatever manuscript they were working on. And I would suspect that Marnie's historical work had some, probably not lots of influence, but some influence on how Tolkien worked with certain military aspects of his and historical aspects of his stories. There's also Charles Williams, and I don't think Tolkien wasn't a real big fan of Williams. He wrote sort of spiritualist novels. He was better known in his time than he is now. Not as many people read him now. They're a little bit odd. They're a little bit maybe harder to throw yourself into than Tolkien's books or Lewis's books too. But I think mostly what he got from Williams was that he wanted spiritual aspects in his novels always, but he didn't want to do it the way Williams did it.
Okay.
I think he thought it was a little bit too direct.
So it's like the anti-example?
I think it was that Tolkien is writing about a time long, long, long ago, and he didn't want to feel tempted to bring in a specifically Christian perspective that couldn't have been in the time when the stories take place. Ages past, in the very old age of the world. He had to resist temptation to make the work specifically Christian. He's using Christian values, but it would be such an anachronism to have specific Christian things in the story. So I think he was trying not to let himself do what Charles Williams could do and get away with, but Tolkien couldn't have, just because of the nature of the stories. That's a couple things come to mind.
Well, I definitely thank you for taking the time with me today. It's been an amazing conversation. I'm sure that if you had the time, I'd bug you to spend a couple more hours just chatting about the subject. I'll have to find a way.
You're so welcome. Yeah, feel welcome to get in touch anytime. I so admire your project and the work you're doing on it. I think it's amazing work. It's significant work, and wish you the best of success with it.
Thank you. Appreciate it, sir. For the audience out there, I do highly recommend Tolkien's Intellectual Landscapes. Tolkien's been a book that I've been reading, since I was a child. My grandmother had copies of The Lord of the Rings that I read, and I read The Lord of the Rings even before I had a chance to see The Hobbit, which the Hobbit cartoon is amazing. But I had never taken the time to break down kind of the literary themes or put it in kind of the scholarly work. And I think your book nicely pulls out some of the background in terms of the structure, influence, things that I had never thought before. And I think it will change the way I read Tolkien in the future in terms of what I'm looking for, how much I notice. And then it definitely changed the way I looked at the films. I always understood that there was a difference between the books and the films, but now I can really briefly and succinctly say, well, this is the reason why these things happen in the film and not in the books, or hey, you really need to go visit the books for these scenes because it doesn't capture the true kind of Tolkienism, I should say.
Thank you.
So I cannot recommend.
I do owe a debt of gratitude to two scholars, and to be fair, I should mention this. The work of Tom Shippey and Verlin Flieger, particularly among many, many Tolkien scholars, powerfully influenced how I went about that book. So just a nod of thanks to them.
So I do recommend it. It's an affordable book, and you can pick it up on Amazon, and I'll leave a link on the screen for the audience there. And I thank the audience for watching, and I do invite them to subscribe to the Evolving Warfighter for more videos on self-development and military history. Until next time, focus on your self-development and to make sure that we can dominate the modern battlefield. Thank you.